Hi. So today I just wanted to talk you through a little bit this Animate1 Java file. So it starts very similar to the graphics one. So I want to point out the key differences. One thing you'll note is I included these explicitly. They're kind of buried deeper in that AWT package, and that allows us to turn our oval and our rectangle into objects, which means, of course, that you can access methods from them and not simply just paint them. Um, but mostly, we're going to look down here. A couple of minor things I did. I made frame width and height into a constant at the top. Now that I look at that, I should have probably made them all caps, but they are constants. Um, the x1, y1, x2, y2, these are important. These are going to be the x and y coordinates of the objects that we're creating. We're going to create two objects that move around. I basically did one, and you're going to have to do another more or less from scratch. The rest of this stuff is basically similar to what you've seen before. Um, I also added this thread. Now, thread is basically it allows you to independently process something. It's a pretty complicated topic that I don't want to dig too deeply into, but you'll notice here that I made this runnable, which allows it to be run effectively as a thread, which is basically a separate um, it's a separate mode of control. It allows me to run it when I do a start, like later down here. I do this t.start and it will execute the run method. Um, Threads allow you to do more than one thing at the same time, but we're going to use it in a fairly simple way. Okay, so where am I? Okay, so those are some of the things. The biggest new things you'll need to pay attention to are this x1, x2, y1, y2. Here, for example, I set the starting element. So what's going to happen? This is your constructor. This is going to be called once at the beginning, but then you're never going to get back to it. So you can, if you wanted to set like a default position for your second object, you might want to put the x2, y2 here. Again, my font. Most of the stuff I did on the previous. And then the last two steps basically kick off the thread, which is the separate running context of the code, and it's going to actually call this method run. So even though it doesn't say it directly, the start will in effect, it does some other background stuff that we don't see, but in an effect, it calls this run method. And in the run method, I set the starting increment for X and increment for Y. So that means that each time my X and Y will move by one. So I started with a very simple movement pattern. If you're going to do the same thing, you might change this to increment of X1, increment of Y1, and then X2, Y2. Then I have while true. So this is an infinite loop. Yes, we do not normally want to do infinite loops, but we're going to do an infinite loop here because we want this thing to just keep going. And it will go until the window is closed, because you'll notice that way back at the top, I set it to close, exit on close. I set the default behavior. Yeah, this step. So it's just going to run in an infinite loop until you hit the X to get out of your graphic frame, and then it's going to close. All right, I'm sorry, back to here. So infinitely, what I'm going to do is just going to add. So by default, at the start, it's just going to x1 and y1 are just going to increase by one each time. Simple enough, right? It's just going to move forward by one. So it should go in a diagonal pattern. I've also, just to give you some ideas, there's all kinds of things you could do with this to randomize its behavior. One of the things I did, and you can uncomment this, is that 1 out of 100 times, it'll just randomly change direction. 1 out of 100 times, it'll randomly change its Y direction, more specifically. So that's just one example of something you can do for randomness. Also, when it does definitely want to change direction is when it gets to the edge of the frame. So if I get to within 50 of the frame, and remember this XY position is basically the upper left corner. That's why I have the minus 50. And I want to change when it gets within 50, I basically negate my increment. If I'm going in the negative direction, I want to go positive. If I'm going in the positive direction, I want to go negative. So that way, this is basically what creates the bouncing around effect. And finally, down here, I do my sleep. So that's going to just basically dictate the refresh rate and every 5 milliseconds. So that's 5 thousandths of a second. It's going to do it pretty quickly. It's going to repaint. And when it does the repaint, what happens, again, some background stuff happens we don't quite see, but the main thing it does is calls this paint component. And this paint component, the first part of it is very much the same as what I did previously, right? I did not change this too much, although it's going to look a little different because now it keeps refreshing. I put something in here. So um, so basically 5% of my circles in that little triangle are going to be magenta, and we'll see what that effect looks like in a second. That was just to kind of illustrate how you can, create some effects on the background pattern. I also, one other thing that is going to look like an effect is the randomness. So this random pattern um, here, this polyline is going to exhibit some randomness because every time I run this, and I'm running this every 5 milliseconds, I'm just going to create a new pattern. But that's not the main thing you need to worry about. The main thing you're going to do is here. It's actually pretty simple. I set the color to red, so I'm going to have like a red ball. I declare it and instantiate it using this constructor. So this is going to make it into an object rather than just drawing an oval. It's going to make it into an object so I can refer back to it later if I want to, and then I fill it, and that's going to give it its structure. You're going to do the same thing for your second character. Okay, so I want you to have another like oval 2. I think I even defined an oval 2 for you that's going to use x2, y2. And it doesn't actually need to be an oval. You could also make it a rectangle or some other shape if you wanted to. But the bottom line here is that you're going to use the x2, y2 in order to drive its coordinates. So you're going to write your code there to do that. Okay, so those are the basics. So it calls the run method. It's stuck in this run method, but each time you're doing the run method, it's periodically going to call the paint. The math part of things should be done here. The calculating your x's and y's should be done in the run method, but the actual painting should use whatever x and y that you set down in here. And let's go ahead and run it, and we'll see what this looks like. There it goes. So a couple of things, like I said, the magenta is going in, so it's mostly pink, but 1 in 20, I think 5% of these, 5% of the time will be magenta, so that kind of flashes through and makes that effect. You'll also note this polygon just keeps getting redrawn at different random points, so it kind of goes crazy. The fact that it bounces off the wall, basically I'm just reversing. If it hits into a wall, I reverse either the X or the Y increment. That's what makes it have that bouncing effect. And that's basically what's going on there. Remember, you want to do the math, you want to do your calculations of your X and Y in the run method, but then have the thing actually rendered in the paint method. The run method is called by the thread. The thread is like It's kind of, you can think of it as like a program within a program. It's executing part of the program repeatedly. You can get into multi-threaded programs, but that's a fairly complex. It gets very complex very quickly. So we'll just stick to using that single thread in order to start kicking everything off with the run method. And the run method then in turn is going to keep calling the other stuff. So hopefully that lends a little bit more clarity and lets you know what we're heading towards. Thank you.